to take up the remaining appropriation bills that fund the federal government. Spending bills include funding for the District of Columbia's fiscal year 98 budget, also $14 billion for Interior Department, and funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. The Senate will also debate $270 billion for the Labor, Health, and Education departments. The House has 5 of these spending bills remaining. Congress must pass and the President must sign these appropriation bills by October 1st, the start of the fiscal year. Watch live House coverage on our companion network, C-SPAN, the Senate here on C-SPAN 2. Tomorrow, President Clinton travels to Missouri to host a Welfare to Work event in a St. Louis factory. He'll be joined by House Democratic leader Richard Gephardt, as well as Missouri's Democratic Governor Mel Carnahan and Republican Senator Christopher Bond. You can see live coverage of this event at 8 p.m. tomorrow on our companion network, C-SPAN.
Now investigative journalist Paul Brodeur. In May, he discussed his book, Secrets, A Writer in the Cold War, at the Midnight Special Bookstore in Santa Monica, California.
As a journalist and writer during the Cold War, it's not going to be popular with devotees of Rush Limbaugh. Neither, however, is it going to be popular with people who love Bill Clinton, Walter Mondale, Gary Hart, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, Dwight David Eisenhower, or the Kennedy brothers. The theme of this book can be summarized in the following sentence, which is taken from one of its chapters. The climate of secrecy and tolerance of misconduct that characterized many of the actions and policies of government and industry during the Cold War exists today and presents a grave threat to the free society in which most Americans would like to think they live. Having said that, I'll read some excerpts from Secrets and try to string them together with a bit of narrative. And when that's done, I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have. The first chapter begins as follows. Now that the Cold War is over, and we Americans have proclaimed ourselves and our way of life to be the winner and still heavyweight champion of the civilized world, people are falling all over themselves to give their take on what it all meant. A rush to assessment, no doubt encouraged by the fact that just over half a century has gone by since Winston Churchill, on March 6, 1946, signaled the beginning of the Cold War in a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, by declaring that an iron curtain had fallen over Europe. As someone whose adult life was more or less encompassed by the Cold War, I was nearly 15 when Churchill made his famous pronouncement, and had just turned 60 when Mikhail Gorbachev was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in June of 1991, I find myself agreeing with the British journalist Martin Walker, who describes the conflict as, quote, the history of the world since 1945. I take issue with the assertion of the protagonist of John Fowles' novel Daniel Martin, who declares that the 20th century did not begin until that year. Seems to me that the 20th century began with the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, which instigated a 70-year-long struggle between communism and capitalism, a struggle that was temporarily interrupted by the exigency of having to deal with Adolf Hitler's Nazis, and resumed so quickly during the Cold War that humankind scarcely had time to appreciate the horror of the Russian sacrifice and the Holocaust that had consumed Europe's Jews before being faced with the prospect of having to live in the shadow of nuclear extinction. When all is said and done, of course, historians down the road, not anyone who actually lived through it, will have the last word about the Cold War. In the meantime, it might behoove those of us who feel obliged to write prefatory chronicles to heed the words of Dr. Bernard Rieu, the narrator of Camus' novel, The Plague, who informs his readers at the outset that it is not his business to take into account the myriad differences of outlook among the people involved in the story he is about to tell, but merely to say, quote, this is what happened, and who acknowledges that he would have little claim to competence for the task he's undertaken had not chance put him in the way of gathering information. I'm going to spare you my childhood and proceed directly to college, I had been a reporter and an editor of the school newspaper at Phillips Academy, and by the time I entered Harvard in the fall of 1949, I knew I wanted to be a writer. Indeed, I wanted desperately to be a writer. Aside from taking the usual short story courses, however, I had no idea about how one set about to become a writer, other than to indulge myself in some highly plagiaristic daydreaming, which is how it happened that during a brief but poignant period in the springtime of my sophomore year, when the Korean War had settled down to a hellacious stalemate along the 38th parallel, I became hell-bent on living a pastiche of what I considered to be the most romantic novel ever written, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. How I happened to choose that particular book as my motif is something I have forgotten. Choose is not the right word to begin with. It would be more correct to say that I wandered into Gatsby with the same kind of half-wishful involvement that propelled its narrator, Nick Carraway, into the social world of West Egg. At any rate, as with most vicarious endeavor, mine had aspects that were superficial and others that were, by comparison anyway, profound. As evidence of the former, I submit a sudden addiction to that insouciant salutation, old sport, which I applied with promiscuous delight, as did Jay Gatsby, to friend and foe alike. And as for the deeper side of my posturing, I confess to having derived considerable satisfaction from the fact that, like the early James Gatz, I, too, had changed my name to conform to a deep, if somewhat imprecisely motivated, need for self-metamorphosis. In my case, it was not a question of amending my surname and given name, but of quietly dropping the uncommon middle name of Adrian, by which I'd always been called by family and friends, and which suddenly seemed too bizarre for further service. As I grew more and more immersed in Gatsby, and therefore more determined to see life through the eyes of its characters and in terms of its action, strange things happened, imperceptibly at first, and then with a vividness that comes only with the most extravagant conceits, I began to hear Daisy's thrilling laughter in the yard, to pass Jordan Baker's wan and haughty face on Beacon Street, and to see all lawns as blue as Carraway saw Gatsby's. Now, when blue lawns become an integral part of a young man's spectrum, there is no limit to what else he is capable of imagining. In any event, that got me started thinking about being a writer. And after college, of course, came the Army, because the Korean War was still in progress, and nobody in those days dared to burn his draft card. However, parts of this chapter that I'm going to read may suffice to demonstrate that we were not the 50s wimps and ciphers that some members of succeeding generations seemed to think we were. Not long ago, I read that Fort Dix has been turned into the largest federal prison in the nation. What a laugh, and how appropriate. And talk about striking a chord. Historians will tell you that the Cold War began when Churchill made his Iron Curtain speech in 1946. But for me, the Cold War began at Dix in the southern part of New Jersey, where I took 16 weeks of infantry basic training in the summer and autumn of 1953. The whole time was grim, but I remember the last part best. We just returned from bivouac, and our captain, who was a hero with Merrill's Marauders in Burma during the Second World War and had won the Silver Star, and who absolutely was convinced that our valor, our incipient valor, and his proven valor was going to be necessary in the Korean War, was determined that we were to make combat soldiers of us. So, however, in an accident out in the bivouac, he broke his shoulder, so he was in the hospital. That night, the captain went off to the base hospital to have his arm and shoulder set and placed in a cast. And the next day, we got Lieutenant Ramsey as our temporary CO, and crazy time started for Company C. The lieutenant introduced himself at 5 o'clock in the morning, after the non-com's whistles had screeched and we had fallen out of our bunks and then out of the barracks and into formation on the parade ground next to the battalion motor pool. He was a red-faced fellow, about our age, and he stood on a wooden reviewing stand in front of us with his arms akimbo and his feet spread apart. Right away, you knew there was something strange about him, because his fatigues were at least a size too small, and so new they hadn't yet been laundered and faded in regular Army style, and the bottoms of his pants weren't bloused and folded down over the tops of his combat boot like those of our non-coms and other officers, but tucked straight inside, which made him look like a civilian deer hunter. "The name's Ramsey," he shouted. "Lieutenant Ramsey. My orders are to maintain this company's combat readiness until Captain Miller is able to resume his duties, and I intend to carry out those orders. You got me?" There was stony silence from the ranks. The lieutenant's face grew redder. "You got me?" he said again. Not a sound came from anyone. "The correct answer to my question, gentlemen, is yes, sir." This time a couple of people murmured the correct answer, but almost inaudibly, as if they were reluctant to swim against the general tide of silence. The lieutenant's face grew even redder. "Give me 50, he shouted. "Everybody." While we were grinding out the push-ups, the non-coms paced up and down through the ranks looking for malingerers, and the lieutenant pumped his folded arms and spread his legs farther apart as if to plant himself more firmly on the reviewing stand. When we were on our feet again, he told us that unless our attitude changed, there would be no Thanksgiving passes. Since Captain Miller had already informed us that this would be the case, the announcement was greeted with a ripple of faint but unmistakably derisive laughter. "Down and give me 50 more, the lieutenant yelled. His face was lobster red. When we struggled to our feet again, the lieutenant told us that if we so chose, we could be doing push-ups all morning. "It's your option, gentlemen," he shouted. "You got me?" "Yes, sir," we shouted back. "That's more like it," he said. "Now I want the barracks cleaned. I want them cleaner than your mother's wash. You got me?" "Yes, sir. Otherwise, I intend to volunteer this company to battalion for guard duty every day from now until and including Thanksgiving. You got me?" "Got you, sir," we roared back. "Get you, mother," whispered someone from behind me. "Now fall out," the lieutenant commanded. "Ah!" we roared and raced for the barracks, whose walls, floors, and rafters had not yet dried from previous applications of soap and water. The line on Lieutenant Ramsey came down while we were on our knees scrubbing the barracks floors. One of the corporals said he was Reserve Officer Training Corps from the University of Rhode Island and hadn't been in the Army any longer than the rest of us. The idea that he was an ROTC college boy set everybody's teeth on edge. As it happened, Bill Collins and I and at least a dozen other members of Company C had gone to college, but it wasn't the kind of thing you got any mileage out of in basic. So we acceded silently to the general imprecations about the adverse role of higher education upon Lieutenant Ramsey's character and conduct, except for Collins, who, perched on a stepladder as he wiped off the rafters, quietly pointed out that Ramsey was probably insecure in his first command because of his lack of experience and was simply trying to act tough in order to compensate. When Lieutenant Ramsey, Collins and I had met earlier, and he and I were going to counterintelligence school at Fort Holabird, but we had to do 16 weeks of basic training first. When Lieutenant Ramsey arrived to inspect our most recent efforts, he marched down the middle of a center aisle between rows of bunks, and those of us who had been frozen in place by the corporals shrieked, "Take shut!" till he came to Collins' footlocker, which he hopped up on and, using as a launching pad to leap high, grabbed hold of a rafter with one hand and, while swinging like a monkey, wiped the forefinger of his other hand across the rafter's upper surface. When he jumped down, his face was redder than usual from exertion, and he held his forefinger in front of Collins' nose. "See that, soldier?" "No, sir," Collins said. "That's dirt, soldier." "Sir," Collins said, "I cleaned that rafter myself, and I don't see any dirt, sir." "Soldier, when I say there's dirt, there's dirt. You got me?" "No, sir," Collins said quietly. "I don't get you." "Corporal," the lieutenant bellowed, "get this man into full field pack and have him do 100 laps around battalion perimeter." It was the worst sort of chicken shit. Straight out of From Here to Eternity, which had just been released and was showing at the Post Theater. And some of the guys who had seen it kidded Collins as he was pulling on his fieldback by calling him Pruitt. It also evoked Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, which I had been reading as an antidote to the inherent despair of Army life, for it established the irrevocable fact that no matter how clean we might scrub the barracks, Got Me Ramsey, as he was now called, would always see to it that we failed inspection, just as the gods kept seeing to it that the stone would always escape Sisyphus's weary grasp and roll once again to the bottom of the hill. The merging of flick and philosophy produced in me a sense of futility so profound that it seemed to give meaning to the very meaningless of scrubbing the barracks floors. In this mood, I not only kept an eye out for the plodding figure of Collins, whose gallant progress around the battalion perimeter gradually grew slower and slower with the onset of exhaustion, but found it possible, indeed necessary, to imagine Collins happy. Of more immediate consequence than literary illusion, however, was the quiet rage that Ramsey's unreasonableness and Collins' plight engendered among the other members of Company C. There were 120 of us in all, including some 80 blacks and Hispanics from Harlem and the Bronx. And since the lieutenant had confined the entire company to barracks, many of us were at the windows that evening to watch him leave his quarters for a night out in Trenton with, according to the duty sergeant, a nurse from the very hospital where our captain lay in pain. The lieutenant wore loafers, gray flannels, and a gaudy plaid sport jacket, the kind that gets worn at country clubs with lime or lemon yellow slacks. And at least 2 troopers swore they could whiff his aftershave from across the parade field. But it was his car, parked out in front of company headquarters, that drew everyone's attention. For the lieutenant drove a reconditioned cerulean blue 1937 Nash convertible with white sidewall tires, leather mudguards, and a raccoon tail hanging from the radio antenna, and with bumpers, trim, and radiator screen of such sparkling and reflective chrome that some people claimed they saw the drivers of oncoming vehicles flicker their headlights before he had even climbed into it and driven away, leaving poor Collins with 30 laps to go and bitterness in every onlooker's heart. The plot was hatched that very night. I forget by whom, but I seem to remember that among the ringleaders were Jeremiah, giant black guy, and some friends who had worked together in an auto body shop in the Bronx. In any event, practically everybody in the company had a hand in the affair before it was over. Things got rolling when the lieutenant returned shortly before midnight, checked in with Corporal Hernandez, who had relieved the duty sergeant, and took himself off to bed. Louis Diaz, a cheerful and diminutive Puerto Rican who was posted outside the lieutenant's window, and who claimed to have 3 wives and children by each of them, something none of us believed until 3 ladies carrying infants appeared together at the orderly room one Sunday afternoon in late October, said that Ramsey had begun to snore as soon as he turned the light out. At that point, while Diaz and some friends regaled Hernandez with pornographic photographs, Jeremiah and his cohorts surrounded the lieutenant's car and, like soldier ants tugging at a scarab beetle, wheeled it off to a storage shed next to the battalion motor pool where, during the next several hours, it was completely dismantled. When I came on the scene at 3 a.m., the floor of the shed was piled high with fenders, doors, bumpers, seats, dashboard, axles, tires, and other assorted body parts. It was surprising how small the various components of the Nash turned out to be, and disconcerting how many of them there were. The largest pieces were from the skeletal chassis, which had already been cut up with an acetylene torch borrowed from the motor pool. The heaviest was the engine block, which became the first thing to be interred by the dozen or so of us who had volunteered to bury the remnants of the dismembered Nash in the company parade ground. Few graves have ever been dug more briskly than those into which we lowered to their final resting places the mutilated remains of the lieutenant's beloved vehicle. It was a moonless, cloudy night, and the parade field soon became a tableau reminiscent of an illustration from my childhood edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, except that no lanterns were held high to illuminate the scene. Finally, the last pieces of the Nash were safely buried and covered over, and a crew of 20 men raked every inch of the parade field to obscure all traces of our nocturnal excavations. By now it was almost daybreak, and the only man not awake was Collins, who was dreaming in the sleep of exhaustion with his mouth open and an arm hanging limply over the side of the bunk. Reveille sounded over the company loudspeaker soon thereafter when the non-coms entered the barracks, whistles shrieking to reinforce the shrill awakening bugle. We nearly trampled them down in our haste to rush out into the gray light and line up before the reviewing stand to await the appearance of our tormentor. The very fact of our presence on top of his car made us incredibly buoyant. We literally danced upon the sand, a dance of joy and triumph upon consecrated ground containing holy relics as we extended our arms smartly and looked left to align ourselves in proper formation. The puzzled lieutenant barely had time to add the familiar interrogative to the announcement that we would be double timing out to the firing range and back that day when we bellowed, "Got you, sir!" Following basic training, I was sent to 6 months at the Army Counterintelligence School at Fort Holabird in Dundalk, Maryland. And then overseas, after Fort Holabird, I was sent to Germany, where a few months later I became, at the age of 23, the agent in charge of counter-sabotage and counter-espionage at the first nuclear underground storage depot in Europe. It was a very scary place, and I have described some of my adventures there. I'll describe the place just briefly. The storage site, called North Point, was surrounded by double chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. The area between the fences was patrolled by armed guards accompanied by police dogs, and the forest beyond the fences was patrolled by members of an infantry company. Incredibly enough, this infantry company, because the duty was so serious and there was such hardship out there, particularly in the winter, the duties of this infantry company were changed every month. So a new infantry company came in every month, and 2 years later, reporting to me on a bitter cold night when the temperature was 0 and the wind chill factor was 30 below, came, you won't believe this, Lieutenant Ramsey. He didn't recognize me, and I didn't let on anything. Access to the installation was gained by passing through a gate manned by an officer and several enlisted men, who examined credentials and waved visitors into a parking lot beside an operations building that was only partly visible. Once inside the fences, all perspectives shrank into the earth. Built as an underground arsenal for the Wehrmacht, the site had been renovated by American ordnance engineers and camouflaged with subtlety and nonchalance by nature. Beneath a vault of trees, the subterranean igloos wrinkled the forest floor into elongated mounds of turf and needles, sprouting ventilators that looked like giant fungi. The whole place seemed eerie and unreal, because it was the citadel of a future too close at hand to be comfortably imagined. Would it survive, I somewhat wondered, as had the Celtic rubble of the surrounding countryside, with sufficient evidence of its secrets for distant historians to explain? Or would the excavators be forced, as with Stonehenge, to speculate on unknown treasures, obscure gods? On the day of my first visit, I introduced myself to the Battalion S2, a chain-smoking captain, who gave me a tour of the premises that included the igloos to which, because I did not possess a Q clearance, one reserved for people working with nuclear weapons, I had neither permission nor need to go, and then he invited me to his office for a cup of coffee. When I remarked upon the stringent measures that had been taken to provide security, he gave a harsh laugh and pointed out a window toward a group of German civilians who, under the watchful eye of a guard, were raking up leaves on the grounds. "Place is a goddamn sieve," he said. "They probably know more about what goes on here than I do." Remembering, I maintained a judicious silence and nodded. The captain looked toward the doorway, above which were mounted twin light sockets, one holding a green bulb that was illuminated, the other a red bulb that was off. "Green means everything okay down in the igloos," he told me. "When the red comes on, there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" The captain shrugged. "Some kind of short circuit usually. Happens when they're arming or de-arming the warheads. I never know for sure because I don't have need to know, but our German friends know, which is how I found out." I don't follow you," I said. "Wait till you hear Bertha." "Who's she?" "I don't want to spoil the fun for you. Some night when the red light's on and you're sick of listening to Hillbilly and the Armed Forces Network, tune into East Berlin. Bertha comes on around midnight. She plays great jazz and classical." I glanced at the doorway and saw that the green bulb was still illuminated. "How often does the red light come on?" I asked. "Often enough," the captain said. "There was one week I hardly ever made it back to the caserne. My poor wife was worried sick." "Couldn't you phone her?" "Red light comes on, the telephone shut down automatically." "Why is that?" I asked. "To prevent the spread of panic," the captain said dryly. "Red light means nobody, not even the colonel who commands this bunch of electronic hotshots, is allowed outside the building. Anyone who tries to leave gets cut down. The guards even have orders to shoot each other." The captain grinned, no doubt at the expression he saw on my face, and bared his teeth. "How we avoid traffic congestion on the road to Kirchheim-Bolanden." After Germany came 6, 7, 8 months in Paris and more adventures, and then back to the USA. In the spring of 1957, I sold a short story to the New Yorker, which was based on my experiences as an intelligence agent in Germany. It was called The Sick Fox. A few months later, I went to New York, and on the strength of the story I'd published, got myself hired by the New Yorker to be its newsbreak editor. This was an entry-level job that entailed the culling of hundreds of newspaper gaffes and non-sequiturs sent in by readers each week and selecting the best and funniest for E.B. White to append his inimitably deadpan taglines. I had very little money with me, and during the month I spent looking for work and trying out for the newsbreak job, I slept on an equally impoverished friend's floor. He was renting a room in a transient hotel on the Upper West Side while attending the Columbia Graduate School of Education. One evening, after a particularly discouraging day, I walked up Fifth Avenue in the enchanted metropolitan twilight Fitzgerald talks about in Gatsby, feeling the loneliness of one of those young clerks of his who loiter in front of windows at the hour of dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. When I got to the corner of 5th and 59th, I sat down for a few moments on a bench just inside the park, looking up at the windows of the plaza, which were coming alive as golden lights winked on, and wondered whether or not I had any future in the city. It was a chilly evening in early April, and an elderly couple wearing threadbare overcoats was sitting on the next bench feeding the pigeons. The lady was holding a burlap sack on her lap, and the old man was holding a bag of grain from which he was broadcasting whole handfuls far and wide to an ever-increasing flock of birds. As I watched, his grand sweeping gestures became more and more constricted until he was casting just a few pieces of grain at a time to fewer and fewer pigeons, and then perhaps only one or two kernels to a solitary bird that, as if sleepwalking, came pecking its way closer and closer until, with a quick movement, the hand that had been feeding the pigeon snatched it and wrung its neck and plopped it into the gunny sack that the old lady opened and closed in the blink of an eye. It all happened so fast I could scarcely believe what I was seeing until I saw him do it several times again without ever once missing, and realized that he and she were harvesting a supper of street squab. I came close to packing it in right then and there and going back to Boston. But the New Yorker came through the following week and I started work instead. It was a dreary business selecting the news breaks, but I soon found myself able to winnow the stack of mail that arrived each morning in an hour or two, which left me time for my own writing. Needless to say, the thousands upon thousands of gaffes that crossed my desk each week have long since merged into a forgettable blur. In fact, the only one I can remember wasn't fit for use in the magazine, at least not in those days. Someone sent in a brochure put out by a company in Queens that pronounced itself capable of storing wedding dresses for future generations. A photograph of a lovely young bride wearing an elegant gown was accompanied by a flowery text that urged its readers, quote, "Let us take your wedding dress and preserve it for perpetuity in one of our special temperature-controlled facilities, where we'll retain all of its pristine glory for some future occasion. Who knows, but that one day your own daughter, or even your granddaughter, may consummate her marriage in it." Scrawled beneath this exhortation was the query, "Can she take her shoes off?" I worked as a talk of the town reporter for 7 or 8 years, and in the middle and late 1960s, I began to write environmental long pieces, long fact pieces for William Shawn, who was the editor of the New Yorker, and who, of course, had published Rachel Carson's famous Silent Spring in its entirety in the New Yorker in 1963, as well as Hiroshima by John Hersey earlier than that. I was asked by Shawn to start doing this kind of thing. He'd been looking for someone to replace Carson because she died almost within a year after she published Silent Spring. And so I was by 1972 specializing in environmental pieces and wrote the first piece on the awesome biological hazard, cancer hazard posed by asbestos inhalation, a devastating public health hazard that has killed 750,000 American workers and will kill another 300,000 or 400,000 in the next 20 years. And in the second piece I wrote, which was called Casualties of the Workplace, I extended my scope to include the chemical industries and a bunch of other industries. And I'll read just one paragraph from that piece because nothing I wrote, it was something that was said by a man named Anthony Mazzocchi, who was then legislative director of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. He was talking about an asbestos factory in Tyler, Texas, where I think some 900 men worked. 500 of them are dead now. The other 400 will probably all die soon. They were just Texas boys, Texas Hill Country near Tyler. And Mazzocchi exposed the conditions in this plant, which had been owned by Pittsburgh Plate Glass, then called PPG. They always changed the name, so you never know who's what. And the Corning Glass Works, which was a spin-off of Pittsburgh Corning, which is a spin-off of the Corning Glass Works. I wanted the whole, this is what Mazzocchi said, and we printed it in the New Yorker, and I put it in the article, and then the New Yorker took out a full-page ad in the New York Times with this quote from Mazzocchi. And I want to read it because I want to tell you that what Mazzocchi said here 25 years ago is absolutely as true today as the day he spoke it. I wanted the whole country to know in detail what had happened at that factory and to understand that what had gone on there, the fruitless Bureau of Occupational Safety and Health inspections, the lack of enforcement by the Department of Labor, the whole long, lousy history of neglect, deceit, and stupidity was happening in dozens of other ways, in hundreds of other factories, to thousands of other men across the land. I wanted people to know that thousands upon thousands of their fellow citizens were being assaulted daily, and that the police, in this case the federal government, had done nothing to remedy the situation. I wanted them to know that murder was being committed in the workplace and that no one was bothering about it. In part 3 of the book, I described the vendetta that the FBI carried on against Martin Luther King and hundreds of other American citizens during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and right on to this day. Some equally distasteful methods were used on Dr. Martin Luther King, whom the FBI had been keeping a watch on since 1957, and had designated as a person who was to be rounded up and detained in the event of a, quote, national emergency. King was under heavy FBI surveillance from the autumn of 1963 until his assassination in March of 1968, and was the target of an FBI smear campaign during that whole 4.5-year period. Wiretaps, initially approved by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy on the grounds that some of King's advisors might be communists, were maintained by the Bureau on King's home telephone, and FBI agents routinely installed microphones in King's hotel and motel rooms in what Bureau memoranda acknowledged was an attempt to obtain information about his sexual activities that could be used to discredit him as the leader of the civil rights movement. Around the time the wiretaps were installed in October of 1963, the FBI distributed a monograph containing a personal attack on King's moral character to the Attorney General, the White House, the CIA, the State Department, and the Defense Department and its intelligence agencies. In December of 1963, shortly before Time magazine named King as its, quote, Man of the Year, FBI agents at Bureau headquarters in Washington, D.C. discussed ways of gathering information to discredit him, which included, quote, placing a good-looking female plant in King's office. In testimony before the Select Committee on Intelligence Activities, some of Robert Kennedy's associates, among them former Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, former Assistant Attorney General Burke Marshall, and Bill Moyers, a former special assistant to President Johnson, tried to deny that Kennedy had known about the microphone surveillance of King's hotel rooms. Their denials were disingenuous, to say the least. Particularly disingenuous was the testimony given to the committee in 1976 by Moyers, who claimed not to have known that the FBI was bugging King's hotel rooms, but admitted that he should have assumed this was the case, quote, unless there was an informer in Martin Luther King's presence a good bit of the time, end of quotes. In any event, an 8-page top-secret summary of King's hotel room conversations, which the FBI sent to Kennedy in March of 1964, made it perfectly clear that microphone server could have been the only source of such information. And I talk about the continuing FBI vendetta against King, and then about the select committee that was set up during the Watergate, after Watergate, to look at this, to look at the Quando Pro, the counterintelligence program instituted by the FBI against hundreds and thousands, really, of American citizens. Because the authors of the Select Committee's report felt obliged to protect the privacy of hundreds of citizens whom the FBI had smeared, the document has an ambiguous and sterile tone. Take, for example, the following passage from the section that describes how the Bureau operated against Hollywood entertainment personalities who spoke out in favor of the Black Panther Party or associated with its members. Quote, when the FBI learned that one well-known Hollywood actress had become pregnant during an affair with a Black Panther Party member, it reported this information to a famous Hollywood gossip columnist in the form of an anonymous letter. The story was used by the Hollywood columnist End of quote. Those two sentences are the only reference in the entire Senate report, congressional report, to the Bureau's campaign to discredit Gene Seberg, whom Donald Stewart, the son of Donald Ogden Stewart and a colleague of mine at the New Yorker, brought to our apartment for drinks in 1963. She was a small, lovely woman in her middle 20s with wide-spaced blue-green eyes and sandy, close-cropped hair, a leftover from her much-heralded film debut in the title role of Otto Preminger's St. Joan. And she wore a fashionably short skirt, a sweater, flats, and almost no makeup. She had recently appeared with Jean-Paul Belmondo in Breathless, a film in which she played a flaky expatriate girl who sells the Herald Tribune in the streets of Paris. And when my wife and I complimented her upon her performance in it, she murmured a few words of thanks and seemed relieved when the conversation shifted to another topic. During the hour or so of her visit, she said very little, though when she did speak, it was with intelligence and charm, and we were left with the impression of a tentative woman, unsure of herself and uncertain of her future, someone who seemed slightly misplaced. Stewart married an Italian photographer soon after that, and I never saw Gene Seberg again, not even in the movies. Nor did I hear of the rumor that FBI agents had succeeded in planting in Joyce Haber's gossip column that ran in the Los Angeles Times on May 19, 1970, or read the updated version that appeared in the Newsmakers section of Newsweek magazine on August 24th. The story in Newsweek had it that Seberg, who was expecting her second child, had not been made pregnant by her husband Romain Gary, the French novelist and diplomat from whom she had been separated for nearly 2 years and was in the process of divorcing, but by a high-ranking member of the Black Panther Party whom she had met in Los Angeles, where she and Gary had lived on and off for a number of years. He'd been the French consul general in Los Angeles, and where she had become active in raising money for black organizations, including the Panthers. As it happened, the FBI hounds had their facts askew. The truth of the matter was that Seberg was not pregnant by the black activist Hakeem Abdullah Jamal, a Quando Pro target with whom she'd fallen in love in 1969, but as a result of a brief fling with a Mexican student revolutionary she'd met while making a film in Durango in the winter of 1970. The first I remember hearing about any of this was in September of 1979, when I read Seberg's obituary in the New York Times. The obituary said that the actress, who was 40 years old and suffering from depression, had killed herself with an overdose of barbiturates. Her decomposed body had been found some 10 days after she had disappeared in the back seat of her car, which had been parked in a fashionable district of Paris. According to the Times, Seberg and Gary had separated following reports in a gossip magazine that Gary, I guess that's Newsweek and the LA Times, that Gary was not the father of the child she was expecting. The discovery of Seberg's body was followed by a series of stunning disclosures. A day or two later, Gary held a press conference in which he charged that her life had been destroyed by the FBI. Gary said that when Seberg had read the rumor planted by the Bureau in Newsweek, she had become distraught, gone into labor, and delivered a premature baby girl who had died 2 days later. He went on to say that the baby was his. He knew it was not, of course, but had assumed fatherhood in order to protect his wife, and that Seberg had tried to commit suicide every year on the anniversary of its death. 15 months later, he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Following Gary's press conference, William H. Webster, later head of the CIA, the Bureau's director, acknowledged that the FBI had planted the rumor to discredit Seberg. He offered no apology, but stated that, quote, "The days when the FBI used derogatory information to combat advocates of unpopular causes have long since passed," adding, "We are out of that business forever." Hello, Richard Jewell. His admission and other statements made the front pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and other major newspapers across the nation. Many of the accounts said that FBI officials had sought to destroy Seberg's reputation because they believed her to be supporting black nationalist groups, and most of them quoted from an FBI memorandum dated April 27, 1970, which had been sent from the Bureau's Los Angeles office to the Washington, D.C. office of its director, J. Edgar Hoover. The memo requested Hoover's permission to plant the rumor about Seberg's pregnancy with gossip columnists in the Los Angeles area, declaring that this would, quote, "cause her embarrassment and to serve to cheapen her image with the general public." It went on to assure Hoover that if the smear campaign were approved, the, quote, usual procedures would be taken by the Los Angeles division to preclude identification of the Bureau as its source. A responding memo from the director's office not only approved of the plan, but also suggested a refinement, recommending that, quote, it would be better to wait approximately 2 additional months until Seberg's pregnancy would be obvious to everyone. As might be expected, a flurry of stories and editorials followed on the heels of Webster's belated 1979 disclosures. Most of the editorials inveighed against the Bureau's misconduct and called for reform, but none of them called for punishment of the responsible officials. Indeed, an editorial in the New York Times placed the whole business in the context of the Cold War by pointing out that the FBI had, quote, suspicions that black nationalism and student radicalism were subject to foreign manipulation, end of quote. In the second half of the book, I discuss in some detail my work as an investigative reporter, health hazards of asbestos I mentioned before, and ozone layer depletion, microwave radiation, power line electromagnetic fields, stuff like that, and the efforts of industry and government to cover up these problems, which have gone on all that time and are still going on today. This drew the attention of the FBI to me as any kind of criticism of the government draws the attention of the FBI and other similar organizations to any journalist critical of the government. And it resulted in a break-in in my New York apartment in 1977. In this part of the book, I mount a heavy attack upon the recent conduct of the CIA and the FBI, which includes a rather stunning revelation about the reasons for the epidemic risk of cancer among foreign service personnel working in the American Embassy in Moscow during the 1960s and 70s. To be more specific, I present some strong circumstantial evidence suggesting that a nuclear device was secreted within the embassy in the 1960s to forestall the effectiveness of the anti-ballistic missile system that the Soviets had installed around Moscow. And of course, there are other possibilities too there in the sense that the Soviets were raiding the embassy. You may remember 20 years ago the headlines in all the papers in the United States. I was one of the first journalists who wrote about it. Soviets were hitting the American embassy in Moscow with very low level, very weak radiation to activate hidden microphones in its walls. Well, the Soviets not only did that to the American embassy in Moscow, we did it to their embassy, and we did it to all their consulates, and they did it to all our consulates, and this was something that had been done in the Cold War starting in 1945, 1946. Everybody did it to everybody. And the other suspicion that may well account for part of the extraordinary rate of cancer, particularly among women who worked at the embassy in the 60s and 70s, is that we brought in countermeasures to suppress the Soviet radiation, the weak signal they were sending in. And the countermeasures were so powerful, they were like a flamethrower being brought in to swat a mosquito. In other words, the entire American embassy at Moscow was awash in radiation. And the book goes into some detail about the denials of Henry Kissinger, Lawrence Eagleburger, other people in the Eagleburger is still, I think, in the State Department. He may have just retired, claiming that Ambassador Walter Stossel wasn't sick, didn't have cancer, as I suggested in a book of mine called The Zapping of America. He not only did have leukemia, as I had suggested, and when he died in 1986 of leukemia, his daughter, Catherine, whom I quote in the book at some length, wrote me a letter saying that her father had developed leukemia when he was ambassador to Moscow. State Department denied it. Henry Kissinger said then, "These are very sensitive and complicated issues upon which I cannot comment," and he has never commented since. As for other gross misconduct on the part of the CIA, let me read a short section from Chapter 30. Now that the Cold War has ended, more and more of its dirty secrets are coming out. In the last few years, we've learned that the CIA made a rich man out of General Manuel Antonio Noriega, the dictator of Panama, who is currently serving a 40-year prison term in the United States for drug trafficking, by paying him millions of dollars for providing the agency with political and intelligence information. We've learned that during the early 1980s, the CIA formed a special counterinsurgency battalion of the Honduran Army known as Battalion 316, and that with the agency's full support and knowledge, the members of this battalion acted as a death squad by kidnapping and murdering hundreds of their fellow Hondurans. We've learned that the CIA created a special intelligence unit among the Haitian police, which became notorious for torturing and murdering hundreds of suspected opponents of the military regime, and that while acting as a paid agent of the CIA, Emmanuel Todo Constant, the chief of the infamous paramilitary death squad called the Front for the Advancement and Progress of Haiti, FRAF, is suspected of having helped plan the killing of Haiti's Minister of Justice. We've learned that the CIA has long given financial support to Vladimiro Montesinos, the military intelligence chief of Peru, who is suspected of having masterminded several massacres of government opponents. And we've learned that General Julio Roberto Alpirez of the Guatemalan Military Intelligence Service, who, like Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza, and the late Roberto Dobison, leader of the death squads in El Salvador, was a graduate of the United States Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, had been a paid informer of the CIA since 1988. Alpirez was on the agency's payroll in 1990 when he ordered the machete murder of Michael Devine, an American citizen who was an innkeeper in the Guatemalan rainforest, as well as in 1992 when he is alleged to have supervised the torture and killing of the insurgent leader Efraim Blanca Velasquez, who was the husband of the American lawyer Jennifer Harbury. All this just in Central and South America. So since lately, in the last few years, we've had a parade, of course, of CIA directors, each one of them, Gates, Woolsey, Deutsch, and now a new guy, George Tenet, who promised to reform the CIA. And this new fellow, who's now about to be confirmed by the Senate, and he will, he's the guy who lifted the clearance and fired this fellow Nuncio, who revealed to the Senate that the CIA had been lying about its connection with Alpirez and the murder of Devine, which leads me to say, thus sending a chilling signal to the American people, the CIA, is that the CIA intends to protect the secret identities of its informers even when they are implicated in the killing of American citizens. As for the FBI, here's what I have to say about its attack upon the Branch Davidian compound at Waco. Attorney General Janet Reno defended the decision to attack the compound on the grounds that children there were being abused, and allegations subsequently proved to be false, and that the hostage rescue team was exhausted after a 51-day siege. Apparently neither she nor anyone else sought to suggest that another hostage rescue team be brought in to relieve it. Whitewash investigations conducted by the Justice Department concluded that although errors were made, there was no way to avoid an armed confrontation with the Branch Davidians, and the whole affair was swept under the rug. As a result, 20 innocent children were incinerated. Subsequently, it came to light that for days before the final assault, FBI agents had undertaken to unnerve the cultists and keep them awake at night by illuminating the compound in the glare of floodlights, by sending helicopters to hover overhead, and by playing music at full volume on loudspeakers. Ironically, few people in the nation's liberal establishment questioned the Bureau's conduct in the Waco Holocaust, no doubt out of a desire to avoid embarrassing the already beleaguered young Clinton administration. So the outrage was left to fester in the paranoid fantasies of government-hating, gun-loving paramilitarists and psychopaths until it emerged as a cause célèbre 2 years later in the wake of the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. What ought to be apparent to anyone capable of casting a backward glance over the past 40 years is that no matter who the directors or what the circumstances, neither the FBI nor the CIA is capable of carrying out meaningful reforms in its methods of operation without strong and persistent oversight on the part of a higher authority. Since such oversight can only reside in the presidency and the Congress, institutions easily influenced by the political expediency of the moment, it seems likely that Americans will continue to live in an era in which secret abuses of power on the part of the police and intelligence communities are tolerated, as they were throughout most of the Cold War, as a necessary evil. Nowadays, thanks to the terrorist bombings of New York's World Trade Center and Oklahoma City's Murrah Federal Building, as well as the gas attack mounted by cultists in the Tokyo subway system, Americans are being urged to approve the relaxation of the strict limitations on domestic surveillance and wiretapping that were imposed upon the FBI by the Justice Department 20 years ago following the embarrassing disclosure that Bureau agents had penetrated anti-Vietnam War groups and spied on Martin Luther King. A proposed omnibus counterterrorism act calls for sealing the nation's borders and making evidence gathered through secret surveillance and increased wiretapping available to government prosecutors in special courts. Proponents of such measures argue that if FBI agents had been able to operate as they had been in earlier times, they might have tapped the telephones and infiltrated the ranks of the extremists who perpetrated the outrage in Oklahoma City. Nobody points out, of course, that during the first 24 hours after the bombing of the Marat building, the FBI sent out flyers all over the country with the drawings of two suspected terrorists, both of whom were unmistakably Iranian in terms of their mustaches and their look. And they went everywhere, to all points bulletin. As a result of that bombing, President Clinton asked Congress for new legislation to create an FBI-led domestic counterterrorist center and a special FBI counterintelligence fund that will increase the Bureau's ability to trace telephone calls and gain access to the records of consumer agencies, hotels, motels, airlines, train, and bus carriers. The Bureau already has a library awareness program in which librarians around the nation are asked to report the names of people seeking access to scientific and technological information. In addition, the President has lifted the 20-year-old ban that prohibits the Bureau from spying on domestic groups without being required to show probable cause that the members of such groups are actually engaged in criminal activity. More recently, in the wake of the downing of TWA Flight 800, he has requested that police wiretap authority be expanded to enable FBI and other law enforcement agents to monitor all communications devices that might be employed by terrorists, such as cellular telephones and pagers, thus creating a situation in which the government will be in a position to intercept thousands upon thousands of private conversations with the push of a button. Memory is the antidote to this kind of foolishness, but memory is elusive and sometimes goes on vacation, especially in an election year. Part of the present tendency to forgive and forget the abuses of freedom perpetrated by members of police and intelligence agencies in recent decades can be attributed to the historians, columnists, and others who, impelled by the end of the Cold War, coming out of the woodwork to give rosy assessments of it. Some of them, the writers of espionage novels come to mind, seem to be filled with nostalgia for the Cold War's ritualistic joustings. Others take the sanguine view that the conflict was a system of political control that prevented local wars from getting out of hand. Still others, William Safire, for example, believe that we had every right to wage the Cold War as we did, not only against our Soviet adversaries, but also against those whom we considered, rightly or wrongly, to be their surrogates. In a column that appeared not long ago in the New York Times, he acknowledged that many of the covert operations conducted by the CIA against leftists in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and elsewhere in Central America were flagrantly undemocratic, but took pains to assure his readers that such, quote, such dirty tricks that would save thousands of lives gained some moral coloration, end of quote. When you let yourself slide backward and forward over the last 50 years, you begin to realize how much the fear of communism gave coloration to all our lives. You also begin to realize how easily that fear could be replaced by new fears that could begin the cycle of dirty tricks all over again. Fear breeds anger, of course, and when the anger could no longer be expiated by the sacrifice of young men and civilians in Vietnam, it turned inward and became the massacre at Kent State. Everyone has his own memories of the Cold War. Mine do not exclude the counterintelligence agents who knew what Klaus Barbie had done but helped him get away. The German scientists who stood by while slave laborers died of cold and starvation in the V-2 factories but got to live in luxury when they worked at NASA's Space Flight Center. The American scientists who irradiated thousands of unsuspecting people for secret atomic research. The State Department physicians who lied to the women they tested for genetic damage. The admirals who tried to blame a dead gay sailor for the gun turret explosion on the battleship Iowa. The high school teacher who kept Lone Tree's civics notebooks all those years, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy giving J. Edgar Hoover permission to tap the telephones of Martin Luther King in order to determine whether King was being influenced by communists. Sometimes I think It's best to let sleeping dogs lie, as the saying goes, like the remnants of Lieutenant Ramsey's car moldering away between the abandoned sands of Fort Dix. Still, there's one thing I can't get out of my mind. The lengths to which our FBI guardians went to protect us from Gene Seberg. So before I close out my interest in the Cold War and the shallow deceptions practiced by the warriors for whom that war became a game, and in the foulness that floated in their wake, I recall again the gratuitous cruelty of what they did to her and the cowardice that lay behind it, not to mention their contempt for women. I'll read just part of the last chapter, which is short. Looking back, it's clear to me that my life took a profound turn at the end of the 60s when I began to devote most of my time and energy to writing about environmental and occupational health hazards. Whether that is a path I'd follow again, I do not know. What I do know is that during the next 25 years, I was witness to a lot of human suffering that could have been prevented had it not been for the ease with which industry and the military were permitted during the Cold War to contaminate the earth and the air and the oceans, to circumvent environmental and occupational health regulations, and to endanger the lives of workers, consumers, and other unsuspecting people in the general population. During those years, I encountered shipyard installation workers who were suffocating to death because their lungs had been irreversibly scarred by the asbestos they installed in Navy ships. Submarine workers who had developed leukemia as a result of being exposed to the emanations from nuclear reactors. Uranium miners who were dying of lung cancer caused by the inhalation of radioactive dust. Military and civilian radar technicians who had been blinded and made deaf by microwave radiation, and people from all walks of life who, by virtue of living in the vicinity of Army, Navy, and Air Force bases across the nation, were being sickened by drinking water that has been poisoned by the millions of gallons of toxic chemicals and other waste that were dumped directly into the ground by military officials who apparently convinced themselves that the exigencies of the Cold War gave them the right to do so. Today, I am contacted with alarming frequency by people who have developed brain cancer, leukemia, and other malignancies after living in homes close to power lines, giving off strong electromagnetic fields. Even more disturbing is the fact that the children of such people, the people living in such homes, are developing and dying of cancer more often than other children. The death of children haunts me, as I'm sure it does most people. During my career as a journalist, I have been called an alarmist by the captains of the asbestos industry, a scaremonger by the detergent manufacturers, a muckraker by the makers of chlorofluorocarbons, a sensationalist by officials of the electronics industry, and more recently, an environmental terrorist by the paid consultants of the electric utility industry. People who are more kindly disposed toward my work tend to regard me as an investigative reporter. In frustration, I confess to having occasionally thought of myself as a kind of literary entomologist, one who overturns rocks in the dank garden of the private enterprise system as it presently exists and describes what he sees crawling out from underneath. The fact is, of course, I am none of the above. I'm simply a writer who worked for a magazine during a time in which its editors believed that public health issues should be written about at length and in depth. That time came to an end in the summer of 1992 when S.I. Newhouse dismissed Robert Gottlieb as the editor of The New Yorker and replaced him with Tina Brown, who has taken the magazine, sometimes referred to these days as the New New Yorker, out of the realm of issues and into the realm of personalities. As a result, I am no longer an investigative reporter, which is fortunate for the development of a sweeter and more forgiving nature. Since one of the downsides of being an investigative reporter for any length of time is it tends to make one cranky and skeptical. Nor, for that matter, am I an environmental journalist. I have retired from The New Yorker and the public health wars I waged in its pages, and thankful for the privilege of having worked at the magazine during its great years, have gone back to the fiction writing that was my first love. Thank you. I'd be glad to answer questions if there are any. Yes?
Well, in view of what you said about these agencies, which most of us know about for quite a while, not all details, do you believe that any American president actually creates and initiates or has the power to create and initiate any policy for this country?
The question is, do I believe that any American president has the power to initiate any policy? I assume you mean policy of the kind I've talked about?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me give you an example, which is in the book. At a national security meeting, I think it was in 1960. If you give me a year or two in the date. Dwight Eisenhower, who certainly has a good reputation among his fellow citizens, was heard to say in very strong terms and got very flushed and angry that we need to do something about this fellow Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba. He was the guy, I remember, in the Congo, now Zaire, who was done away with and was replaced by Mobutu, who's now on the way out, and a new guy is coming in over whom we have little control, but Mobutu was our boy for almost 30 years there. The CIA, and as I say, I describe this in detail in the book, sent a man named Dr. Gottlieb down there. He was the same guy who was involved in the giving of LSD to that fellow who went out the window in New York. I forget his name now, famous case. With a syringe full of botulism and stuff to kill Lumumba. And the CIA station chief, supposedly, the CIA cover story has always been, we didn't kill Lumumba, because everybody's denied that Eisenhower had anything to do with it. But immediately that the president said that, the intelligence national security advisor in the room assumed that he meant that was a euphemism for let's get rid of Lumumba. And they did. So if that's an answer to your question, I'm not sure.
No, in the sense that, well, we do know about Eisenhower. I mean, he wasn't the most worldly of men, you know, after he got out of the...
God help us if he wasn't. He'd be the head of the...
Well, the point is, I don't think a statement like that about Lumumba initiated in his mind. What I'm trying to say is, he may have reflectively said the thing because of what, you know, he heard. I just don't believe that the people who we elect have any real power, because no matter who we elect, no matter what party they're in, the same policies go through. So I don't see it as something created by the individuals.
Okay, I don't know if you all heard that. The gentleman believes that no president, no matter what party or how he's elected or when, has any power to really initiate any policies, or I assume what you mean is to control the CIA and the FBI. Well,
or any other
agency. Well, I mean, if he doesn't with the powers of the executive, I don't know who does. Of course, the president has the power, it seems to me, to control the FBI and the CIA to some extent, by whom he appoints as the director. And when you think of Gates, Woolsey, Deutsch, and Tennant, all of whom have got dirty hands in this whole business, having been appointed now by the last two presidents, in the space of, what, 5 years? We've had 4 appointees to the CIA post. You begin to wonder why they don't appoint someone who will clean the agency up. They all come in and say, we're going to clean it up, but then, of course, they don't clean it up.
Do they have a choice?
Well, what do you mean? Why doesn't the president have a choice?
Have a choice to appoint somebody other than these people, since both different presidents do the same thing.
I assume that the President of the United States, being without a doubt one of the most powerful chief executives in the world, has the power, if he chooses to use it, to clean up an outfit like the FBI. Yeah, I would think so.
Well, John Kennedy tried to do something with the CIA, and he disappeared pretty fast.
Well, John Kennedy got rid of Richard Bissell, who mounted the Bay of Pigs operation, and he got rid of Allen Dulles, who was the director then. I forget who we replaced him with. Not a very prominent guy. But I mean, if your point is that the president, the chief executive officer of the United States, doesn't have the power to change the federal police, in this case the CIA or the FBI, I simply can't agree with that.
I know, as a matter of their role as defined in the Constitution, they have the power.
Senate confirmation is an issue.
I'm trying to establish whether they really have that power to act independently of other interests in this country that exist no matter who is president.
Well, there are political considerations, of course, and we've seen this with the present president in any number of ways, and we see it all the time, not just with Clinton, but with everybody else. Yes, the answer is I do think the president, if he wants to, can certainly alter the culture and the character of the CIA and the FBI. I don't think any of them want to, because I think they want to use these organizations as an instrument of their policy. And I think they've been very happy to. Yes?
The point then is, for industries, why do the presidents, the information, for example, that you and people, and writers like you, bring to the attention of the public, certainly must come to the ears and the eyes of our presidents. And why do they not make some attempt, or a much stronger attempt than any has, to try to change the law, to try to control these industries?
The answer to that, the question is, why do American presidents, in terms of the occupational and public health outrages and crises and problems that exist, why don't they make any attempt to change the character and the conduct, I think is what you mean, of industry? And the answer to that is money, which we know very clearly from the contributions. In the book, I write extensively about the public policies of a man whom I once admired greatly, and who, in fact, read several of my asbestos pieces into the congressional record himself, Senator Walter Mondale. Once he was running for president, his three top advisors were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year as consultants to the asbestos industry, and he never said anything about it. Money is the key to this whole thing. Industry provides a president with money, and as we know from these scandals now, whether it's foreign industry or American industry, it generates the machinery of our country. And this is where presidents, of course, get back to this gentleman's question, I think remain powerless because they're greedy and they need this money.
Yeah, but that's my point. They're powerless.
Yeah.
Power, but not the will.
No.
Okay.
If somebody had the will to do some of the things you want, what would happen?
It would be.
What would happen? I don't know. Nobody has. I mean, certainly. The question is, if somebody had the power and then I'm in the back row, I agree with him, says the will to change this. You see, I think that what was it? Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's one of the problems here. Yes, ma'am.
The Waco fiasco. Who gave at the moment some kind of constitutional trespassing warning flag in the journalism field? I would imagine there was attention from the right, but I think it's a very complex time. At that moment, there was the leftover, the law and order feeling coming through, and also that punch-drunk sort of liberal enthusiasm going on. So I think to see that situation clearly, the Waco fiasco, I'm just wondering who was paying attention to that in the right way.
What? I'm sorry. What? I didn't get the
press corps was paying attention to the.
Who were the press corps paying attention to in the Waco fiasco? Well, I think the press corps was the immediate press corps. The newspaper guys were camped out during the 51-day siege. You remember that the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms people, had mounted a sneak attack and been beaten off with a couple of dead. And here these people were, with all these children in this compound, were holed up, being bombarded with sound and lights, and for 51 days. And then finally, they brought in military tanks with military tear gas, which was known to be highly flammable, by the way. This idea, there's absolutely no proof of this nonsense about these children were executed, and that they said that the cultists set that fire. The real possibility and the probability is that by blowing all that tear, remember the big pictures of those tanks with the huge funnels that were jammed into the building, and then they poured the tear gas in there. Well, if there'd been a pilot light on the stove, the whole thing would have gone up, and this is undoubtedly what happened. But they lied about it. Just the same way Janet Reno lied about the fact that there were children abused there. That wasn't true. I think the problem was, as I suggested in my talk, that most people on the left in this country, most liberals, most people in the center, were embarrassed for Clinton at that point. He was having trouble with Lonnie Guarneri. He was having trouble with his attorney general nominations. They didn't want to embarrass him. It was a terribly embarrassing thing. The incineration of 20 innocent children ought to be embarrassing to any. I mean, I always thought that if this ever had happened in France, the country I lived in for a time, you'd have seen tens of thousands of French citizens linking arms and walking down the Champs-Élysées. I've never seen that in this country. The only time I've ever seen demonstrations was in the Vietnam War. But it was that kind of outrage. And to be silent about it and let it fester in the right-wing paramilitary paranoia of these people who apparently did blow up the building was a major problem.
See, I see the opinion of that on the press. The third estate really had to come in at that point and revitalize the situation, saying this is constitutional trespassing. It was up to you guys. Now, I assume your voice was clear through this, but I'm wondering, who are the press heroes at that moment who could have set history straight by saying, okay, the guys made a mistake here?
Who are the press heroes in Waco is the question. I don't think there were any press heroes in Waco. I think a lot of people, and I'm doing it, came out afterward and said, gee, this is an outrage. Oh, I felt it was an outrage at the time. I thought the Ruby Ridge was an outrage, where the FBI moved in and gave orders to shoot to kill, and kill a boy and then kill a woman with a baby in her arms. I mean, there's an FBI agent under indictment for that. He's been indicted, and he's supposedly now going to talk. We'll see. Yes?
The Oklahoma probably could have been prevented if the press had really left on that, I think.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, you know, I'm not going to defend too much the press. The press's duty is to describe what's going on. I'm not sure it's the press's duty to remind American citizens time and time again, or perhaps it is in editorials, certainly not in news articles, of what their sense of decency should be. I'm not so sure that the press should be telling people, pointing out to people that it's wrong to incinerate 20 children. I think if Americans don't know that on their own, we're in trouble. And I think we're in trouble largely, as I try to suggest this afternoon, because we're not controlling the police agencies in this country. We're allowing them to run amok. We're allowing them to go utterly unpunished, all kinds of misconduct, and this is the kind of thing that leads inexorably to police states. And it always had. Yes?
I wonder if you could speak to the future of investigative journalism. With campaign contributions dictating what investigative hearings we won't have from Congress, with full-page ads from competing electric companies accounting for deregulation of the electrical industry without anybody in California having an opportunity to become informed by their newspaper in advance so they could participate in the outcome. How will the words get out that need to be heard with these economic forces against truth-telling?
Ellen Stern Harris, you've almost answered your own multi-part question there. If you think you're going to get me involved in a multi-part answer, I mean, you know, I was at dinner last night and somebody told me, a friend of mine from a journalist from Washington, D.C., that James Fallows, the journalist I respect a lot, who's the new editor of U.S. News and World Report, has stated a policy that the U.S. News and World Report is not going to cover a lot of issues that the magazine doesn't believe, having taken polls, the American people want to be covered. Whoa. Now, let me tell you, you know, this whole idea has always been operating undercurrent in journalism in the United States, and you hear it particularly in small towns, not big cities like L.A. and Los Angeles and New York, but the idea that, well, we should be telling people good news. What's right with America? What's great? Well, you know, I mean, we hear that from the president, so on ad nauseum, that obviously it's not journalism. As far as the electromagnetic thing goes, I've written a whole chapter in this book. You know, I wrote a couple of books about it and pieces in the New Yorker. It's one of the great pioneer scientists in the world is here today, a man whose science, W. Ross 80, whose science about the effects of low-level electromagnetic radiation in the brain will be legion one of these days, and are in the profession already. And who was chairman of the National Radiation Protection Council committee a year or two ago, which recommended that the level of electromagnetic fields be absolutely lowered a fantastic amount over a period of 5 or 10 years in schools and homes, where it's now rampant in LA. But you know, you can go out, I remember when I first wrote the first piece on asbestos that had ever been written, on the dangers of inhaling asbestos, back in 1968. It took more than 10 years, a decade, before the Congress finally removed that stuff from schools that were just pouring down over kids' heads, where they stopped spraying it. Well, it was 5 years before they stopped spraying it on buildings, releasing trillions of fibers into the ambient air of American cities. These things take time, and public education is very slow here, and people are going to, and the press here is being very poor. For example, there's a study out of Australia done by a guy working for Australia Telecom, and one of the very large animal study, whose results were just announced last week, which I believe the mice were developing cancer twice, was it? Twice the rate of the control animals. This was headlines in all your French newspapers, all your major newspapers in London, England, San Francisco Chronicle, Tokyo, not one mention. The LA Times, the New York Times, or anywhere else. Why? I mean, you know, yes, sir.
You talk about the danger of a possibility of a police state because of the agencies that control this whole aspect. Could you comment about the control of the press and how that has, to my mind, a greater capacity for misleading people, for changing the attitudes, for, other than just policy, but having good stories and stuff?
Well, I can. Okay.
What gets into the press and what gets out of what's kept out of the press are, to me, extremely important issues. And how that happens seems to me to be an important aspect of what you're talking about.
All right, let me describe it to you as I see it now. I'm giving you my opinion about why the newspapers last week did not report as French newspapers did, as English newspapers did, as the newspapers did in Japan, with the exception of the San Francisco Chronicle, report the new and stunning studies on electromagnetic radiation and cancer, electromagnetic fields from power lines and cancer. And by the way, there are also simultaneous studies done in both California and Finland, suggesting very large epidemiological studies suggesting that this kind of electromagnetic fields from the power lines causes an extraordinary increase in Alzheimer's. The question is, will I comment upon why this happens in the newspapers, why the role of the newspapers in keeping stories from the American people, which the gentleman, how it happens, which the gentleman correctly suggests is a major problem, just as these out-of-control agencies such as the CIA and the FBI. It's money again. For example, in your average newspaper, somewhere between 50 and 70% of the revenues are real estate advertising. And the word of the devastating consequences of being exposed to strong electromagnetic fields from power lines is having a devastating effect in turn on the sale of homes near those power lines. And there's a very powerful interest in this country that do not want this to be known. So there's one example. Now, in your newspapers like the New York Times, which has always had a perfectly appalling record, a derelict record in writing about anything about this kind of radiation, the Times was sued in famous cases way back in the 70s by two of its young editors who were using the first VDT machines, video display terminal word processors. And they both developed at the age of 28 or 29 cataracts, which they shouldn't have been developing at that age because the radiation out of those machines was just incredible in those days. And the Times went before, it was a big case and it got a lot of publicity, and the Times just dug in its heels. And if you look at any newspaper bullroom today, you will literally see, in a space like this, almost 100 personal computer BDT machines. The radiation out of those machines and out of the screen is bad enough, but out of the sides and backs, that close together, by the way, in schools too, is extraordinary. No one's going to know what the hazard is until somebody does a study of the people who worked in these rooms and does it 20, 25 years down the road when, after onset of first exposure, disease can be expected to come up. But so I've tried to answer it in two areas.
What you're saying is that corporate America controls both the government and the media through money.
I'm not saying that. Okay.
What do we do about it?
Okay. The question the gentleman is asking is does corporate America control the media? I don't think corporate America entirely controls the media. For example, my career is some witness to the fact that they don't. But let me talk about my own magazine. When William Shawn was the editor of the New Yorker, he published John Hersey's Hiroshima in 1946. Then he published Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1963. Then he let me do all that job on the asbestos industry, which brought them to their knees and cost the insurance industry $60 billion B for boy dollars and other stuff. That's gone now. That's no more. The perception in the New Yorker is that, well, you know, we're not going to run this kind of tough stuff. We're going to do personality. So we got Donald Trump in this in the most recent issue. But there is still good investigative reporting out there, and every once in a while the newspaper do it. They simply aren't doing as much. And one reason they're not doing as much is that people aren't demanding it. Who is speaking out today that you hear in the United States the way Tony Mazzocchi spoke out 25 years ago when he said murder was being committed in the workplace and no one was doing anything about it? It's like it's almost bad form to say that today. Nobody wants to know that. Don't rock the boat. Stock market's going up. Hey, things okay. Let's just keep the lid on it. That's the trouble. Because, you know, Pogo once said, we've met the enemy and he is us. That's true.
Paul, you've made no mention of the organizations of science which are supposed to be the watchdogs of public policy, and specifically the scandalous behavior of the National Academy of Sciences through its operating arm, the National Research Council, is not a matter of public concern in the way that it should be. The reports that are written in behalf of the National Academy of Sciences by the National Research Council are only possible with funding that is secured from tainted sources.
You're absolutely right.
And this most recent instance of this so-called report on the safety of the electromagnetic exposure in the homes is an absolute scandalous travesty which in no way reflects what is known. And the worst aspect of it is that the press release that was put out worldwide on the morning of October 31 was prepared by staff and not by committee, and was not seen by the committee until after it was released. That is the sort of thing that is so bad from the point of view of any attempt to put science in a national perspective.
Were you able to pick up that comment? Was that loud enough for you to pick up? Okay, I don't have to repeat it then because it was so well said. I would hate to have to give a précis of it. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that I did, the book was going to press actually the following week, and I was able to hold it up and write a chapter about what I think of the National Academy, National Research Council, and my own experiences on it, because I sat on 2 National Research Council committees, and I write about the one time when we were asked by the National Cancer Institute. See, the National Research Council, you've got to remember, is financed by the government. All of its money comes from National Cancer Institute, CDC, or NIOSH, or some other governmental institution. And it always puts, when it staffs its committees, it always puts as many people from industry as it does from the independent scientific community. And I remember one time being on one of its committees back in the 70s, more than 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago. We were supposed to decide what the American worker should know about the cancer-producing chemicals he's working with. Well, we sat around these great green velvet tables with busts of Lincoln and Ben Franklin and everything, and these hallowed marble halls, and there's all this money going in and out of there. The study was going to cost $850,000 or something. And I said the first day, well, simple, we can get up and walk out of here. We don't have to come down here once a month for the next year. Under constitutional democracy, you should know everything, right? Oh, that's not the way it works. We had to sit there and deliberate. And then at the end of the 8 months, I was supposed to write the part of the report where we all finally agreed, because how could you not? American workers should know everything, right? That night I got back to New York, and the staff officer of the National Research Council called me up and tried to get me to agree that I put this in the book, that to soften the changes in the report that the whole committee had agreed to. And I asked him if he were convening the whole committee again. Oh no, he said, we're just trying to achieve consensus. I told him I didn't think cancer worked by consensus, and that if he tried to pull this stunt, I'd call a press conference at the New York Times. Of course, that's the last time I was ever asked to sit on the National Research Council committee. So this is what happens, yeah.
Before the computer begins to resemble the television television industry, do you think that might be the last frontier of pamphleteering or some horizon of hope for people who really want to connect to information that's been democratically assembled?
The question is, do I think the computer offers a ray of hope? I assume you mean on the internet about disseminating information. Well, I got to confess to you, when my grown children set up my computer for me a year or two ago, I live on Cape Cod and I live part of the year out here in San Diego, they made me leave the house so they could make it, quote, idiot-proof. So I'm not exactly someone to ask about the future of the internet. I think it's probably a good thing, and I think your suggestion is right, that by getting a lot of information out there, you know, even though a lot of it is maybe garbage, my one question will be, how will you ever separate it all out? And I see, you know, one future of it being everybody's just sitting before the set forever, yeah. and when do you do anything about it? So I don't know about that.
For more discussion with journalists and authors, join us this weekend for About Books. The program focuses on writers, ideas, and the business of books. You'll see lectures and speeches by authors, interviews with booksellers and publishers, book signing events, and tours of major bookstores. About Books, exclusively here on C-SPAN.